The morning sun seemed warmer than usual in Brooksville, a small Georgia town where the days tended to pass slowly and predictably. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the park as dozens of children ran through the trees, carried away by the excitement of the school trip. The teacher, Mrs. Taylor, with his notebook in hand, observed the group with the attentive gaze of someone who already knew well every step and every distraction of his students. Among them was Michael Carter, a 10-year-old boy with deep eyes and a serene expression, the kind of child who preferred to observe in silence rather than compete for attention. As his classmates played, Michael slipped away from the group, drawn by something no one else seemed to notice. A narrow path winding between the park's ancient trees, covered in dead leaves and shrouded in an eerie silence. Mrs. Taylor looked around and realized too late that the boy had disappeared. Panic spread like wildfire, screams, searches, and running. Police and parents were called, but nothing made sense. 30 minutes later, he emerged from between the trees. His clothes were soiled with dirt, his hair was plastered with sweat, and he had a distant look in his eyes, as if he had seen the impossible. In his hands, he held a colorful beaded necklace with a small white cross hanging from the center. Mrs. Taylor recognized it at once. That necklace was the same one that Emily Rose, the girl who disappeared 5 years ago, was wearing it. The day she disappeared in that same park. And before anyone could ask what had happened, Michael whispered in a trembling voice, "She asked me to bring it back." Silence fell over everyone. But what no one knew was that for that boy, time had stopped, and something ancient had just awakened. But who was that voice calling him from the trees, and why did it seem so alive? If this story has already left you curious and with that shiver of mystery, subscribe now and leave your like. Because what comes next will prove to you that not all silence from the past is truly dead. Brooksville had always been the kind of town where time seemed to slumber. Wooden houses, streets lined with oak trees, and an ancient church bell that chimed the hours with almost religious precision. Everyone knew everyone by name, and secrets, when they existed, were buried under the weight of silence. The elementary school, where Mrs. Taylor had been teaching for 2 decades, it was the heart of the community, a haven of routine and safety. But ever since that day in the park, something unseen had been in the air. The children returned home, quieter, the parents restless, and the necklace found with Michael Carter became the whispered topic in the city's corridors and cafes. Officer Reynolds, the police officer in charge of the former investigation into the disappearance of Emily Rose, was called back with some resistance. He had already buried that case in his memory, along with the failure of never having found the girl. Now, seeing it reborn through another boy's stirred wounds he thought had healed. Mrs. Taylor, still in shock, relived Michael's gaze. There was something in those eyes that didn't match his age. An old weariness, a kind of memory that didn't belong to him. When the boy's mother, Mrs. Carter, arrived at school to pick him up, the embrace between them was tense, almost restrained. She held him tightly, but Michael remained motionless, as if the human touch no longer reached him. During the night, the city lay awake. The wind blew through the park's trees, making the old iron gate that had remained locked since the tragedy 5 years earlier creak. Some residents swore they heard children's laughter mixed with the sound of the wind, soft, distant, like echoes of something time had tried to erase. The next morning, as classes resumed, Mrs. Taylor noticed Michael staring out the window, his eyes lost in the park. No words, no gestures, just that empty, unsettling stare. And in that moment, she had the nagging feeling that Emily Rose's story wasn't over yet. But what began as silence would soon turn into signs. Signs that no one could ignore. The days following the trip were marked by a silence that seemed to extend beyond the school walls. Michael Carter returned to class, but something in him had changed. He didn't speak, didn't play, and barely responded to the teacher's calls. He spent long minutes staring into space, as if listening to a distant voice the rest of the world couldn't hear. Mrs. Taylor tried to ignore it at first. She believed the trauma of his disappearance explained his behavior, but gradually, his unease turned to fear. During class activities, Michael began drawing. First, meaningless scribbles, then more defined shapes. What stood out was the repetition. Always the same colorful necklace, the same red beads, and a small white cross in the center. He drew with an almost obsessive precision, as if each stroke carried weight. Mrs. Taylor kept one of the sheets, impressed by the detail. When she showed it to Officer Reynolds, he recognized it immediately. It was identical to the necklace found years earlier with her belongings, Emily Rose. At home, his mother noticed her son waking up in the middle of the night, sitting on the floor and whispering children's names. Sarah, Daniel, Emily, he repeated, as if summoning imaginary friends who came to visit him in the dark. When she shook him, he would fall back asleep. Murmuring a final phrase that gave her goosebumps, she asked me not to forget. At school, Michael began writing strange words on the board when no one was looking. One morning, Mrs. Taylor came into class early and found him standing there, chalk in hand, staring at the wall. On the board, in shaky letters, it read, "She's still waiting in the tunnel." The teacher's heart raced. That sentence echoed like a sentence. Over the course of the week, objects began disappearing from Michael's backpack and mysteriously reappearing in the park, as if something or someone was calling him back. His mother swore to lock the doors at night, but always found him with dirt on his feet in the morning. When Mrs. Taylor tried to talk to him, Michael looked up and said in a calm voice, "She doesn't like it when you don't believe her." That sentence remained etched in the teacher's mind like an invisible scar, because deep down, she felt the boy wasn't joking. And that, maybe, that voice that accompanied him had never gone away. But what no one knew was that as they tried to understand the boy, something began to move around him, something that defied logic and time. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere of the school began to change subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if an invisible weight had settled within the walls. The children's laughter no longer sounded as spontaneous. The hallways seemed colder, and the natural light that once illuminated the classrooms seemed to have lost some of its brightness. Mrs. Taylor, who had always believed in reason and the balance of the human mind, began to feel an uneasiness she couldn't explain. At times, I felt as if I were being watched. When she turned around, she found only Michael, motionless. His eyes fixed on her, a gaze so deep it seemed to pierce her to the core. Arriving early one morning at school, Mrs. Taylor noticed the classroom was different. The chairs were not in the same place, and a window, which she swore she had left closed, was swinging in the wind, creaking slowly and uncomfortably. On the board, there was a new drawing, the same necklace, but now with a crack running through the white cross in the center. The chalk was still on the floor, as if someone had left in a hurry, and beside Michael's desk, she smelled a faint metallic smell, similar to rusting iron. Over the next few hours, the strange events began to intensify. The school clock suddenly stopped at 17, the same time Michael had disappeared. During the field trip, the lights flickered frequently, even when the weather was stable, and some teachers swore they heard small footsteps in the hallway during class, as if a child were running back and forth, though no one was outside the classroom. The janitor, a skeptical and practical man, claimed that one day he found Emily's necklace hanging on the doorknob of the principal's office, gleaming in the dim light, even though no one had touched it. At home, things were no different. Mrs. Carter, exhausted and emotionally fragile, began to hear her son's voice in the middle of the night, talking to someone. One day she woke with a start and went to his room. Michael was sitting up in bed, his pale face illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the curtains. He stared into the dark corner of the room and murmured in a calm, almost loving tone, "I brought the necklace. Now she can come out." His mother approached, trying to wake him, but the boy didn't seem to hear. When she finally turned on the light, there was no one there, just the necklace lying on the pillow, clean and cold as ice. It was in that moment that Mrs. Carter understood that her son wasn't just being tormented by memories. He was somehow part of something much bigger. The next morning, Mrs. Taylor arrived at school, and as she walked through the gate, felt a cold breeze brush her face. The sensation was clear and unmistakable. Something was moving inside. And it was then that everyone realized what was happening could no longer be explained by reason, much less ignored. The unease that had been hovering over Brooksville began to spread like a thick fog. Parents, teachers, and even the most skeptical began to admit that something was out of control. The necklace, now kept in a safe at school, seemed to shift position on its own. Some mornings, Mrs. Taylor would find it on Michael's desk, glinting in the early morning light, as if someone had placed it there while everyone was asleep. It was at that point that Officer Reynolds, pressured by the community and haunted by old memories, decided to revisit the case. He believed that perhaps in some forgotten detail there was a rational explanation, a human error, a misunderstanding, anything that would restore some sanity to the town. With an aged face and a heavy heart, the police officer returned to the Brooksville Park for the first time since Emily Rose's disappearance. The place felt different. The tall grass, the rusty gate, and the profound silence gave it an almost sacred air, as if time had stopped at the very moment it all happened. Reynolds walked slowly through the trees, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the dry leaves. As he approached the old entrance to drainage tunnel, felt his stomach churn. The entrance was sealed with wooden boards and chains, but there was something strange. Fresh, small handprints in the dirt, as if someone had tried to break in. The policeman turned on his flashlight, and for a moment he thought he saw something moving in the dark interior of the tunnel. A reflection, perhaps, or simply fear taking shape. Still, instinct made him back away. On the way back, a cold breeze blew through the trees, bringing with it a distant sound, almost a whisper. Reynolds stopped. The wind seemed to whisper his name. Emily. For a few seconds, the veteran police officer remained motionless, trying to convince himself that it was just the wind playing with his tired mind. When he finally got into the car, he noticed something in the rearview mirror. Colorful bead necklace, it hung there, swaying slowly, as if placed there by invisible hands. He held it, his heart pounding, and felt the cold metal of the cross touch his skin. He took it to the police station, locked it in a drawer, and left, determined never to speak of it again. But the next morning, when Mrs. Taylor arrived at school, she found Michael sitting at his desk. He was drawing calmly, his eyes fixed on the paper. When she approached, she noticed that he was drawing the same necklace, now hanging from a mirror. In the corner of the page, in childish handwriting, was a single sentence: "He knows where she is." Mrs. Taylor swallowed, unable to decide if the "he" referred to the police officer, the boy, or something neither of them could control. And that was when the first clear sign appeared. A message so direct and frightening that no one could pretend it was happening anymore. It was a cloudy Thursday when the pent-up tension in Brooksville reached its breaking point. Classes seemed to be proceeding normally, but something in the air weighed heavily on everyone, a kind of silence that precedes a storm. Mrs. Taylor was grading papers when she heard a sharp crack like glass breaking. She turned and saw Michael, standing in the center of the room, his gaze fixed on something no one else could see. The children backed away fearfully, and the atmosphere became dense, almost unbreathable. The boy was trembling, but his expression remained serene, as if listening to instructions coming from a distant place. Suddenly, he dropped his pencil and walked to the board. With trembling hands, he picked up a white chalk and began to write with slow, steady movements, as if someone were guiding his gestures. The room fell into absolute silence. Not a sound, not a breath. When he finished, he turned and looked at the teacher. On the board, in firm letters, he read, "She's stuck in the tunnel." A shiver ran down Mrs. Taylor's spine. The phrase seemed to pulse in the air, as if the chalk still vibrated. The children began to cry, and one of them swore he heard a female voice whispering Michael's name. The teacher ran to him, holding his shoulders, but the boy seemed entranced. His eyes rolled back and his mouth half open. Then, suddenly, he spoke in a voice that wasn't his own. A female voice, soft but filled with pain. "It's dark. No one came to get me." Panic gripped the room. Mrs. Taylor screamed for help, and within minutes the entire board was there, watching the frail boy repeat the same words like a broken recording. When she finally managed to wake him, Michael looked around, confused, and began to cry. He said he didn't remember anything, only that she was calling. The news spread quickly throughout the city. Some believed it was mass hysteria, others a supernatural calling. But Officer Reynolds, upon hearing the teacher's story, knew he could no longer ignore his instincts. He returned to the park that same night, and at the iron gate that sealed the tunnel, he smelled something different. A strong scent of wet earth and iron, mixed with something more subtle, the sweet perfume of old flowers, the same one Emily had worn when she was alive. The police officer pressed his ear to the boards and swore he heard a muffled sound, like distant crying. Stepping back, he looked up at the sky and noticed that the moon seemed lower, closer to the earth. The park felt alive, pulsing, as if it had a heart of its own. And it was in that moment that Reynolds made a decision that would change everything. He would return to the tunnel with a team. But what he didn't yet know was that when he did, the entire city would be forced to face a truth it had tried to bury. Because the next morning, the gate was opened, and what was inside should never have been found. The next morning, Brooksville Park looked different, as if it knew something was about to happen that would reawaken what had been forcibly put to sleep. The sky was overcast, and a cold wind stirred the treetops, making the old iron gate guarding the tunnel entrance creak. The research team, led by Officer Reynolds, arrived at the scene accompanied by 2 experts, a firefighter, and a small group of city volunteers. Among them was Mrs. Taylor, who had insisted on participating, convinced that it was all connected to the boy. She didn't trust coincidences, not after what she had seen happen. Inside the classroom, as the chains were removed and the boards ripped out, an ancient, damp and dense smell escaped the tunnel, as if releasing air trapped for years. One of the men turned on his flashlight, revealing a narrow passage covered in slime and the imprints of children's hands on the walls. The sound of the constant dripping of water echoed, creating a somber melody that seemed to come from another time. Reynolds took a deep breath and was the first to enter. With each step, the sound of his shoes on the water formed a slow, almost ritualistic rhythm. The teacher walked behind him, clutching the flashlight tightly. Every now and then, she thought she heard Michael's name whispered among the noises. The lights flickered, and an inexplicable chill filled the air. Inside, the walls seemed to pulsate, covered in faded inscriptions, symbols drawn with what looked like charcoal or dried blood. One of the experts commented that such markings didn't exist in the old building. Records. Suddenly, the firefighter in front screamed. Everyone ran to him, and his flashlight illuminated something partially buried in the muddy ground. It was a children's backpack, worn by time, covered in dirt and rotting leaves. The label was still legible: Emily Rose, 4th grade. The silence that followed was absolute. Reynolds swallowed hard, his heart racing. He knelt and carefully unzipped the rusty zipper. Inside were soggy notebooks, a corroded pencil case, and a small, undamaged blue hair. Tie. Mrs. Taylor brushed her hair back from her face and peered into her backpack. Among the objects, one sheet caught her eye: a drawing of 2 children holding hands in front of a wooden door. A blonde girl and a dark-skinned boy with a white cross around his neck. She felt a shiver run through her body. The drawing was identical to Michael's. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the tunnel, as if something had moved just behind them. The flashlights flickered, and for a brief moment, everyone swore. They saw a childlike shadow run across the wall and disappear into the darkness. Reynolds ordered the search to be called off and everything packed up. But as he left, he noticed something that made him pause. There were small, fresh footprints leading from the tunnel's interior to the exit, stopping right in front of Emily's necklace, which now rested on a rock, clean, as if someone had just left it there. But what was inside that notebook would be the missing piece, and proof that the past was never really buried. The notebook found inside Emily's backpack was taken to the police station and placed on a table, still damp and covered in yellow stains. The paper looked too fragile to handle, but Mrs. Taylor, he couldn't pull away. As the experts analyzed the pages, she watched from afar, her heart racing. Every line, every childish scribble seemed to carry a silent story that had been waiting for years to be told. When one of the pages finally dried, what emerged made the air in the room heavy. It was a simple drawing, done in colored pencil, 2 children holding hands in front of an iron gate. One of them was Emily, wearing the same blue dress she'd been wearing the day she disappeared. The other, with dark skin and large eyes, wore a gray t-shirt. Her face, the shape of her hair, the way she smiled. Everything was unmistakable. It was Michael Carter. A chill ran down Mrs. Taylor's spine. She knew it was impossible. Emily had disappeared 5 years before Michael was born, and yet there was his portrait, painted by a girl who had never met him. The police officer Reynolds, upon seeing it, he blanched. He tried to find a logical explanation, coincidence, projection, anything that would keep him from going crazy. But the dates were written on each page, written in Emily's childish handwriting. The pages were dated 2016. Michael was born in 2021. In the following drawings, the story became even more disturbing. There were images of dark tunnels, a broken lantern, and symbols drawn on the walls. The same ones Reynolds had seen personally during the investigation. On one of the last pages, a shaky sentence accompanied a drawing of a white cross surrounded by red spots. "He'll remember what I couldn't tell him." Michael's mother was called to see the notebook, but upon opening the pages, she began to cry uncontrollably. She said her son always drew the same symbols, the same colors, the same hands clasped together. She said he spoke of a girl trapped in the dark, and that he dreamed of a voice calling for help. Mrs. Taylor approached and on impulse asked the woman if Michael had said her name. The answer came in a barely audible whisper. "Yes, he calls her Emily." Reynolds slammed the notebook shut, as if trying to imprison something that had just escaped. Silence fell over the room, thick, suffocating. It was clear that these pages were not simply memories of a child. They were a link, a bridge between 2 souls separated by time. Emily had drawn a boy who hadn't yet existed, and now that boy held in his hands the necklace she had left behind. Mrs. Taylor left the police station with the weight of the revelation on her shoulders. Outside, the wind blew hard, and she swore she heard children's laughter mixed with the distant rustling of the trees. She looked up and saw a flock of crows circling slowly over the park, as if guarding the secret of something about to emerge. But what no one expected is that, in trying to decipher those pages, the true meaning of the necklace would reveal something much darker, a truth that time has tried to hide. The days following the notebook's discovery plunged Brooksville into a near-deathly silence. It was as if the entire town had suddenly become complicit in a long-held secret it preferred to ignore. The news didn't make the newspapers, but it spread in whispers through the school hallways and church pews. No one knew what to say, and those who did preferred to remain silent. Meanwhile, Michael Carter became the center of an invisible force that seemed to slowly consume him. The teacher, Mrs. Taylor. He noticed the boy growing paler and paler, his eyes sunken as if sleep hadn't visited him in days. He no longer drew, just stared into space, his lips moving in silent prayers. His mother, desperate, said he spoke to someone at night, and that sometimes when she entered his room, she would smell the soft scent of flowers, the same perfume Emily wore when she was alive. The necklace, once a mere object, now seemed to react to his presence. It glowed in different hues when Michael held it, and sometimes emitted a barely perceptible sound, like the soft clink of glass. One night, Michael collapsed. He woke up screaming Emily's name, his body convulsing, and objects in his room began to vibrate. The white cross on his necklace fell to the floor and cracked in half. When the boy finally calmed down, he looked at his mother and whispered through tears, "I saw what happened. She tried to save me." These words echoed like a sentence. Mrs. Carter rushed her son to Mrs. Taylor's house, and together they searched for Officer Reynolds, who now sounded more like an obsessed man than a police officer. He spent the night listening to the boy recount, in a low, measured voice, details that no one but Emily herself could possibly know. He spoke of a game of hide and seek, of a locked door inside the tunnel, of muffled screams, and of the water slowly rising until it covered everything. He described the clothes Emily wore, the flashlight she carried, and even the sound of the school clock striking 17, the exact moment the tunnel was sealed. When Michael finished speaking, there was absolute silence. Reynolds, his hands trembling, searched through his old files and found the case report. There was the same time, the same tunnel, the same necklace listed as unrecovered. But what disturbed him most was a forgotten note at the bottom of the page, "Gate sealed." By order of the school administration. The policeman looked at Mrs. Taylor, and the look they exchanged said it all. This had not been an accident. It had been a hidden human error. The next morning, Reynolds returned to the tunnel, alone. He carried the necklace in his pocket and his heart pounding. When he arrived, the air seemed to vibrate. The wind blew through the boards, making a sound like sobbing. He knelt, placed the necklace on the earth, and closed his eyes. A faint sound echoed, and for a moment he swore he heard children's laughter. When he opened his eyes, the necklace was spinning slowly, and a white light emanated from the center of the broken cross. Reynolds recoiled, overcome with dread and fascination. That night, Michael slept soundly for the first time in weeks. He dreamed of Emily. She walked among the trees in the park, smiling, and said serenely, "Thank you for remembering for me." When she woke up, the necklace was in her hand, completely restored. Mrs. Taylor, seeing this, understood that the boy had seen what no one else had dared to face. Emily hadn't disappeared alone. Someone had locked her inside, and time had somehow allowed the truth to find a voice through Michael. But when the truth comes out, it never comes alone. And the price for uncovering it may be higher than the city is willing to pay. The revelation of what really happened to Emily washed over Brooksville like a silent but devastating wave. There were no headlines, no protests, no Immediate arrests. The town reacted as it always did to things it couldn't understand, with silence. Officer Reynolds, once seen as a man of authority and poise, became a spectre of his own guilt. He discovered that the order to seal the tunnel had come from the school's former administration, which feared scandal and legal liability. Emily had been forgotten in the name of reputation. The knowledge of this consumed him day and night. He tried to present the evidence to the prosecutor, but the records had mysteriously disappeared, and Emily's notebook, containing the dates and drawings, had been stolen from the police file. Mrs. Taylor, distraught, openly accused the local authorities, but no one would listen. They said she was emotionally shaken, obsessed by the tragedy, unstable. The town wanted to move on, as if erasing the memory was the only way to survive. Meanwhile, Michael grew increasingly distant. He no longer smiled, no longer played. He spent his afternoons sitting by the window, watching the closed-off park in the distance. At night, he said he could hear Emily whispering across the wind, begging him not to let the world forget her. His mother, overcome with fear, decided to move. But the feeling was that wherever they went, something would follow. She even burned the necklace once, but the next day it reappeared on the dresser, clean, intact, as if it had never been touched by fire. Reynolds, devastated by his helplessness, surrendered his badge and disappeared from the city without a trace. Some said he was seen walking near the park, muttering to himself, asking for forgiveness. Mrs. Taylor, in turn, requested leave from the school. On the last night before leaving, she returned to the park, pressed her cold hands against the gate, and prayed softly. She said that as long as she lived, she would never allow Emily's name to be forgotten. Yet as he walked away, he swore he heard a childish laugh coming from the trees, light, almost sweet, as if the girl had finally heard his promise. In the months that followed, the town tried to get back to normal. The park was closed permanently, children avoided going near it, and Brooksville felt peaceful again. But longtime residents swore that as night fell, faint lights could still be seen dancing beneath the trees, and the sound of chains carried on the wind. For many, it was just the past, echoing. For others, a warning. But on the night when silence finally seemed to win, something happened in the Carter household, something that would show that not all souls had found rest. Time passed, but the weight of that story continued to hang over Brooksville like a shadow the dawn couldn't dispel. The park's trees, now shrouded in constant mist, seemed to hold the secret of everything that had happened there. The town feigned normalcy, but the silence of the night still carried echoes of children's voices, and the wind, when it blew stronger, sounded like ancient laughter, mingling with the rustling of leaves. Michael Carter, now 13, had become an introspective, almost reclusive boy. His mother avoided talking about the past, but sometimes she would find him sitting by the window, staring out at the park, as if something were calling him from there. Doctors said he suffered from episodes of dissociation, but Mrs. Carter knew it wasn't just that. Since Officer Reynolds' disappearance and Mrs. Taylor's departure, the boy seemed to carry a silent purpose, as if he still had an unfinished mission. One cool autumn afternoon, Michael left a note on the table and left the house before sunset. The note simply said, "I need to return what isn't mine." The mother only noticed his absence when night fell. Desperate, she went out into the streets, calling her son's name, but the wind seemed to swallow her voice. Meanwhile, Michael walked slowly toward the enclosed park. The iron gate remained locked, covered in rust, but the boy slipped through a narrow gap. Between the bars, as if the space itself had opened to welcome him. In his pocket, Emily's necklace glowed faintly, illuminating the way as he approached the old tunnel. The earth still exuded the same damp, metallic smell as before, and the air was heavy, as if each step took him deeper into a time that was not the present. He stopped before the sealed entrance and knelt silently. He placed the necklace on the ground and closed his eyes. The wind suddenly stopped, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then a gentle breeze touched his face, and a childlike voice, sweet and clear, whispered in his ear, "Now you can rest." When his mother finally arrived at the park, she found him sitting there, leaning against the gate, his eyes closed and a slight smile on his lips. On his lap, the necklace lay, clean, intact, and a small white cross had been added, made of school chalk. The woman hugged him, crying, not understanding how it was possible. Michael slowly opened his eyes and murmured, "She's not alone anymore." That night, a white light lit up in the middle of the park, lasting a few seconds before disappearing. None of the neighbors could explain it, but they all felt something different, as if an invisible weight had finally lifted. But the next morning, one last sign would prove that the past, no matter how much it rests, is never completely silent. The next morning, Brooksville seemed to breathe differently. The fog that always blanketed the town in the early hours dissipated more quickly, revealing quiet streets, silent trees, and a breeze that carried something almost sacred. It was as if the entire place had finally exhaled the air trapped for years. The park, surrounded by yellow ribbons and memories, dawned bathed in a soft golden light, the kind of clarity that not only illuminates, but purifies. The branches swayed gently, and the distant sound of the church bell marked the beginning of a day that, though ordinary, carried the weight of the inexplicable. The news spread slowly, spreading through the city like a whisper between half-open doors and shuttered windows. Michael Carter had slept soundly for the first time since the incident. No nightmares, no screams in the night, no whispers from the trees. The boy had simply rested peacefully, as if something inside him, something that haunted him, had finally found rest. On the dresser, the necklace of colorful beads remained gleaming, the small white cross hanging motionless. Reflecting the light streaming through the window, it looked new, clean, alive, but there was something else in that glow. A presence, a stillness that was not earthly. Mrs. Taylor, who had left town shortly after the incident, returned that day. Something inside her, perhaps a silent need to understand, had driven her back. As she entered the Carter home, she felt an involuntary shiver, not of fear, but of reverence. The atmosphere was different. Gone was the dense chill that usually permeated the space, nor the heavy silence that seemed to hide something. The air was light, warm, almost welcoming. In the bedroom, Michael sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. His face was serene, his eyes calm, the expression of someone carrying a secret, but no longer a burden. When she entered, he turned and smiled, a smile that blended innocence and wisdom, as if he'd experienced something words could never explain. He held out the necklace to her and, in a calm voice, simply said, "Now she's home." Mrs. Taylor was speechless. That simple phrase, spoken with such sweetness, carried an almost spiritual weight. It was as if the boy was speaking of something she couldn't see but could feel. A serene presence, a silent farewell. She accepted the necklace, holding it between her hands, and in that instant she realized the cold that had always accompanied her since Emily's disappearance had completely vanished. That afternoon, the city moved with a different kind of rhythm. The park reopened, albeit briefly, and dozens of residents appeared, many of them silent, carrying white flowers. There were no speeches, no ceremonies, just simple gestures, petals being left at the gate, gazes turned to the ancient trees, where the wind blew like a prayer. The church bell rang 3 times, its sound echoing across the hills, and for a moment everyone felt something had been restored. Grief turned to remembrance, and remembrance to peace. As the sun sank behind the mountains, the park was bathed in a soft, golden light. The leaves danced slowly and a cool breeze blew past, light as a farewell call. The necklace hanging from the main gate swayed gently. The white cross reflected the last ray of sunlight, shining like a small beacon that insisted on remaining lit. At that moment, the final narration takes shape, with a calm and paused voice, like a prayer that echoes in the void. He came back, but he left a part of himself where time never passed. The image slowly fades. The park disappears into the shadows, and the screen fades to pitch black. The sound of a distant wind fills the space, and a phrase emerges like a whisper from a place between dream and memory. Stories don't end. They just lie dormant until someone has the courage to tell them again. For a moment, everything falls silent. No music, no noise, just absolute silence, as if even the air itself were listening. Then, a final soft note emerges, lingering in the air, and the narrator's voice returns, deep and captivating, gently bringing the audience back to reality. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel now. Here, we give voice to what time tried to erase. Like, share, and get ready for the next story. Because sometimes, what seems forgotten is just waiting for someone willing to listen. And as the final sound fades, an imaginary breeze seems to pass through the screen, leaving the viewer with the feeling that something, or someone, is still watching from a distance in silence, waiting for the next story to be told.